My name is Christie Norris. I'm the director of Carolina K-12 at UNC Chapel Hill. Behind the scenes is my wonderful colleague, Paul Benici, who's there if you have any technical issues or need technical assistance as you're all logging in and getting settled for the program. We are really excited to be here with you this evening to have a conversation exploring the high cost of cheap, the Hamlet, North Carolina factory fire of 1991. This event is part of the William Friday Virtual Education Series sponsored by the North Caroliniana Society. The North Caroliniana Society was founded by H.G. Jones and is dedicated to the promotion and increased knowledge and appreciation of North Carolina's history and heritage. And Carolina K-12's partnership with the society has allowed us to serve hundreds and hundreds of teachers all around the state with free quality professional development, both in person and now virtual, because the society, like us as teachers, understands the importance that teachers as professionals and lifelong learners and scholars themselves need the time and space for high quality lifelong learning. And as a former middle school teacher myself, I'm so appreciative of them for valuing teachers as some of the most important professionals who are critical to our state's success. I know that those of you teachers joining us this evening are doing so likely incredibly exhausted with major Zoom fatigue. And so I want to say, I know you're teaching in a situation you did not sign up for, and it is harder than anyone who's never been in the classroom could possibly imagine. So let me just say that we appreciate you, we support you, we praise you, we lift you up. Whatever you need, reach out, and if we can help, we will. Also, you need to hear this if you haven't yet today. You are doing a great job. You're doing a fantastic job. Even if it doesn't feel like you are, you are. So thank you for your service. We are here this evening to discuss a difficult story in North Carolina's really recent history, which is the 1991 fire at the Imperial Foods plant in Hamlet, North Carolina. So please feel free to use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen to ask questions throughout the event, because our conversation will largely be driven by the questions you submitted when you registered and also the questions that you submit live here tonight. In his riveting book about the Hamlet fire called The Hamlet Fire, A Tragic Story of Cheap Food, Cheap Government, and Cheap Lives, Bryant Simon argued that the systems put in place, both at Imperial and in the wider food production industry, came together to cause this preventable tragedy. And you'll hear panelists address these systems and more this evening, systems including deregulation, either by law or lack of enforcement, the demand for cheap labor, a culture of silence and intimidation among workers in plant management, changes to the meat industry itself with its shift in the 1980s to highly processed, mass-produced chicken products, and ultimately an American addiction to a concept of cheap. All of this, Bryant Simon and our panelists argue, contributed to this very avoidable tragedy. And before I introduce our panelists, I just want to ground us in the people, the individual lives that were most impacted by this almost 30 years ago.
When you got 3 or 4 children and that's all the income you have, you can put aside what he said and do the work.
People that was working there 17, 18 years weren't making no more than $5.50 an hour. That's all they were paying, no matter what. They was more concerned about profit because if a piece of chicken fell on the floor, they'd tell you, pick that damn chicken up. And you see magnets and then rotten chicken and stuff, and that's the worst part. Now you want to get sick, that was it. So I tell you, when you eat chicken, you don't know what you're eating.
They never had a drill as far as I know. I didn't have one while I was working there. There was no sprinkler systems in the plant. There was a lot of things you knew that wasn't right, but if you complained about it, you got fired.
We always said that we was gonna catch hold of each other if there was ever a fire, because they never did fire drills or anything like that.
when we came back in that Tuesday morning, we was off that Monday. When we came back in that Tuesday morning, they was working on it then. And when you walked in the front door, you could smell the gas then. It was so loud until it burned your eyes. You walk, you know, you smell the smoke, you smell the gas fume. If they don't get a new broiler here, they're gonna kill somebody. And they did. 25 of them.
In the other news today, in the small town of Hamlet, North Carolina, 25 people died when an explosion and a fire gutted a food processing plant. Many of the workers inside were trapped, and 40 other people were injured.
Somebody ran to the door and they say, "Y'all run, the plant is on fire." And of course everybody looked that way, you know. And then somebody else come through the door, "Y'all run, y'all run, y'all run, the plant's on fire." And everybody just went haywire, you know. And in the area that where I went, we ran into the freezer, and somebody say, "Turn around," say, "Go back the other way," say, "The fire's coming this way." And when we started back out, we was trapped that way. We had to turn around and go back. Then we got trapped in there. I can't say how many, but I know we was like this. And everybody was, it's praying, hollering, men, women, you know, "Lord, let me out. Somebody help me get out. I got my children home."
So, with us today to discuss the events that led up to and took place at the Imperial Foods chicken processing plant in 1991, as well as the broader implications of this really recent history and what it highlights, are three very incredible scholars. I would love to introduce to you Joanna Smith, who is the Associate Director for State Outreach at Carolina Public Humanities, where she helps to facilitate publicly engaged scholarship around the state. She is a PhD candidate in the Department of Religious Studies at UNC Chapel Hill, and her research traces the shifting sensibilities around nature, violence, and animals in American religious history. She's currently finishing a dissertation that examines the sacrificial dimensions of contemporary hog slaughter in North Carolina. And Joanna, thank you so much for joining us. And I should note, she just started her job at the beginning of this pandemic. So we feel for you starting a new job during this time, but you're knocking it out of the park. So keep it up. Next with us is Dr. David Zonderman. He's an alumni distinguished undergraduate professor and department head of history at North Carolina State University. Professor Zonderman teaches introductory, advanced, and graduate courses in U.S. history, American labor history, history of nonprofits, and public history. He's the author of 2 books, Aspirations and Anxieties, New England Workers and the Mechanized Factory System, 1815 to 1850, and Uneasy Allies, Working for Labor Reform in 19th Century Boston. David, thank you for being here. I know, like so many of our educators tuning in from kindergarten to university, you are teaching online and spending a lot of time on Zoom. Hopefully, well, we're all getting Zoom fatigue, but we appreciate you for being here and hanging in here with us. And this is also true for our phenomenal guest, Mr. Howard Kraft. Howard is a child of the Black arts movement. He's an artist and professor, a playwright, a radio drama creator, poet, essayist, and educator, really of all ages. His one-man drama, Freight, The 5 Lives of Abel Green, was staged at New York City's Here Theater and the New Federal Theater. He's a recipient of the North Carolina Arts Council Playwriting Fellowship for the Wise Ones, as well as the Durham Arts Council Emerging Artist Grant. He's a 2-time recipient of the North Carolina Central University New Play Project. He's a professor of the practice at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And most relevant for this evening, perhaps, his play Orange Light commemorates the approaching 30th anniversary of North Carolina's worst industrial disaster, when, as we've said, in 1991 in Hamlet, North Carolina, the Imperial Food Products chicken processing plant fire claimed the lives of 25 employees, injuring 55, most of them women and women under the ages of 30. So Howard, thank you for joining us as well. And I'm actually going to start with you, the storyteller. So as the author of this incredible play, Orange Light, I know that you spent a lot of time researching the Imperial Foods chicken processing plant fire from September 3rd, 1991, as well as looking at the working conditions in the plant and ultimately the negligence that led to this fire. So could you first just give us an overview of the story? What happened? And also, how did you first come to learn about this? And what moved you so much about this story that it made you write this incredible play, Orange Light?
Okay, well, I guess I should start with the basics of the story, or the basics of the story. I wish I could say it is an outlier or a new story or a story that no one's heard before, but it is not. It's the story of basically what happens in an impoverished community when you have right to work and you have decreased regulation. Because everything about the story is preventable. None of this had to happen. This wasn't a tragedy that was, an act of God or something like that. This was an act of man or a non-act of man. So basically what happened was you had a chicken plant in Hamlet, North Carolina, that sadly at that time was the highest paying job in Hamlet at $5.25 an hour, if you can imagine that. The plant had like 215 employees, which is a significant number when you think about the size of Hamlet, North Carolina, which is a very small town. And so everyone in the community on both sides of the color line were touched by this event in one way or the other. But you had a plant there that had not been inspected in 11 years. And you also had a poultry inspector, not the safety inspector, that would come by regularly and not report anything. Employees complained of the use of rotten meat used to make chicken nuggets to cover up the smell. There are just so many injustices. But what happened was that the owner of the plant, Emmett Rowe, concerned that he was losing profit, so the story goes, that he was losing profit by chicken being stolen, $2 chicken parts. He decided to lock the exit doors, which is a violation of Fire Code Basic 101. And he locked these doors. He had a cooker that had malfunctioned and flared up just days before this and had been problematic for years. And instead of, paying the money to fix it correctly, he, Jimmy rigged it, had mechanics, inside the plant, piecing together parts, just whatever it took to keep it running at the lowest cost. And they had to get a new hose for this cooker. And so instead of buying a new nozzle for the hose, they tried to fit in the old nozzle from the old hose, couldn't handle the pressure. And so you have hydraulic fluid start spraying everywhere and it hits the cooker. And the next thing you know, you have a fireball and you have people trapped because the doors are locked. The plant didn't have a sprinkler system. They didn't even have fire alarms in the back. So the people in the back of the plant would know that the plant was on fire before they actually smelled, the smoke or it got to them. The people who were at the front of the building were able to get out of the front exit, but the others were trapped. Some tried to get out through the loading bay. Just the worst of everything happened that day. A truck was blocking that exit. You had people run into the freezer thinking that, they would be safe in the freezer, but the freezer, like everything else in the plant, the doors wouldn't properly seal. And so a number of people died inside the freezer from smoke inhalation. At the end of the day, 25 people died. 18 of those people were women, and most of those women had young children. 55 were injured, and that's very important because when we say injury, we're not talking about, you know, a little burn on the arm. We're talking about people whose lives were irreparably changed because of the health issues that they would deal with for the rest of their lives. I remember the story of one woman who was in her off time taking classes in nursing, hoping to be a nurse, but after the accident, she can't hold information in her head because of the smoke inhalation and effects on the brain, et cetera, et cetera. People with long time lung injuries that can't live without, you know, oxygen tank with them, all kinds of horrors of 55. And the worst part of the story, well, not the worst part of the story, the loss of human life is the worst part. But in the lawsuit, the state awarded $808,000 for the families. And, you know, when you think about, and that was the highest amount at that time in the state of North Carolina. But when you think about $850,000, you know, over 80, almost 80 people, some of these who will never work again for their lives, that's not a lot of money at all.
Right.
And that would actually change the law in North Carolina with regards to what workers can receive in these types of situations. The owner of the plant, Emmett Rowe, was sentenced to 20 years in prison. He only did 4 years and got and was released, actually less than 4 years, and he was released from prison. His son, who ran the plant on the day-to-day, part of the plea deal was that, or the deal that was done was that his son wouldn't be charged and wouldn't receive any time. Although his son worked there every day and, you know, knew that these doors were locked and did nothing to change that situation. And so what in the initial spark to write the story, was the news. I heard about it, but, you know, I hadn't intended on writing anything about it. And then there's another artist, poet, columnist, Thomas I. McDonald. I think he writes for the Independent now. And he had written a performance piece about it. And I was so moved by his performance piece. I began to, I'm also a poet, and in some of my work make mention of it. Most of my work deals with the African-American working class. And so, you know, I hadn't intended to write a play about it, but it just came, the story just bothered me so much. The human tragedy, you know, the families destroyed, the town. Initially, the project started with a good friend of mine, Kathy Williams, who's a director at, also a professor at UNC. And I think she also works with Lyndon Harris and Hidden Voices, which is a really socially active and politically astute theater group here. And they do really good work. And in her freshman class, the idea was that I would, we do a seminar. She would work with the kids on the seminar, students doing research on Hamlet. And we would take that research and I would help them to create a performance piece from that research. But then I would use the research on my own to develop my own theater piece. And so that's what we did. And I had a lot of really good help and advice as I was getting the research together. Of course, the students' work. Took a visit to Hamlet with the director of the piece, the students did a piece and then professional theater did a piece. And Joseph Meagle, who I worked with for years, directed the professional piece, and Kathy directed the student piece. And we went to Hamlet and we got to see the town, and we didn't get to talk to anyone about it. It's not something, you walk up on the street to somebody and just start talking about, but we're able to get a feel of the town. I was able to look at oral histories that reference people talking about it. But one of the biggest gems that I had in writing the piece, and was I got to work with the historian Brian Simon, who wrote the tragic story of Hamlet, cheap labor, cheap food, and cheap lives. And I also, not only reading the work, but I got to interview and talk with Brian several times throughout the process, because I took a different take on it. Well, not so much a different take, but I didn't set it in in Hamlet. I set it in a fictional town, Selton, and I kept the facts to the case true, but I changed names of characters, combined people to show different things, the different elements of it, and also to show that it's not just something that could happen in North Carolina, but could happen anywhere where you have, severe deregulation. One of the reasons that the plant wasn't inspected, and one of the things that the writing this taught me is how much stuff is connected. One of the reasons that the plant wasn't inspected in 11 years is because the budget was cut on a state level to pay for inspectors. So there weren't enough inspectors to inspect it, The laws that were on the books at the time, as weak as they were, would have prevented this from happening had they been enforced, right? You can't operate a business like that without a sprinkler system, even in 1991. Right? So that led to the writing of the play, being able to work with Brian Simon, and just the importance that this story continue to live, so that these events won't be repeated.
Right. And I think stories are so important, for all of the history teachers that are joining us. Really breathing those stories back into history and humanizing people and developing empathy is so critical. And I feel like that's one of the things that your play does so beautifully. I was lucky enough to see it in January in Durham. Was that really a goal of yours, to really kind of bring out the stories and the relationships? I thought you did such a beautiful job showing the relationships between these workers and kind of telling their just day-to-day realities. You did a really beautiful job with that.
Thank you. My approach as a writer, as an artist, is very much focused on character. I think that if people don't connect to the characters, to the lives, then they don't connect to the general thing. If it's just a plant caught on fire and a certain number of people died, you might get, oh, that's terrible. But when you see dramatize a person who experienced that, then you can connect in a human way to what happened. Right. And so you get a better sense of it. It becomes more real, through make-believe.
Yes, and that is exactly what every teacher needs to do in history class. You just said that so beautifully, that when we can make those connections, it always reminds me when I was teaching the Holocaust and you say 6 million Jews, that doesn't really, that's awful. But when you start to look at those individual lives and families and the repercussions and the way they were affected, that's when you really start to build that empathy and that connection. So I think that's such a powerful piece of your work. And it also goes to speak to why it's so important to use theater and film and art integrated with history to tell these stories. So I want to bring you in on this, David Zonderman, as we kind of continue this conversation. And I'd like you to add on to what Howard said. He did such a great job talking about this situation in Hamlet, but talking about how this isn't a one-off. This wasn't just shame on you, Imperial Foods, North Carolina, and Hamlet. This is kind of happening all over. And so I'd love for you to talk a little bit about labor history in general in North Carolina. What were the systems and structures, some of what Howard was scratching at there, that set the stage for these conditions in this event, from deregulation, as he mentioned, perhaps to the lack of unionization. How did we get to the point of this boiler exploding, literally and figuratively?
Sure, happy to do that. And I think Howard has done a terrific job framing it. And I'll sort of pick up on a whole bunch of things he's already sort of put down, a whole bunch of really good breadcrumbs or chicken pieces or whatever we want to call it. And the first thing, I would completely agree with what Howard said, that there's nothing inevitable about this. It's nothing like, well, it had to happen. There was no way to avoid it. Anything like that is frankly just nonsense. This was a product of years, if not decades, of historical changes, forces, and as Howard said, deliberate choices made by politicians, by regulators, by business folk, by mayors, all kinds of people. Now, I want to add, I don't think anybody, including the people who ran the plant, were saying, gee, let's have a horrible fire. But they made a whole bunch of decisions that I think anyone looked from the outside would have looked and said, this is not a good idea. Nothing good is going to come of this. You are, again, pardon the terrible pun, you're playing with fire here, and something bad is going to happen. So yeah, let me pick up on a few things. Couple is to and this comes out of, again, Howard mentioned Brian Simon's book, I just think is a superb book. Wonderful book to teach. For my fellow teachers listening in, I think you can certainly use parts of it in a high school class, certainly in an AP class. It's just extremely well written. It sort of tells a kind of broad, almost weaving tale, but as a way of getting the reader sort of back to the big points. So it's kind of like at moments almost an adventure or a mystery that you keep sort of following the trail back to important issues. But Dr. Simon raises a couple of points about Hamlet itself. You have to understand that Hamlet was a small town undergoing a lot of economic change in the 1970s, 80s, and early 90s. It had once been, the railroad at one time had played a huge role in Hamlet, both bringing people in and out of town, and it had a railroad repair yard. Much of that business left in the decades following World War II. And so Hamlet went from being sort of a little railroad town to being a very little kind of sleepy town with not much work. And as Howard himself said, think of a labor market where a job in a chicken processing plant is considered one of the better jobs. The nature of the work itself is pretty gruesome, although in this particular plant, and I know Joanna is probably going to talk more about this, there wasn't a lot of slaughtering done. It was more sort of post-production processing. It was sort of making the nuggets and things like that. But that in and of itself, the work is often in freezing cold. In other areas, it's really hot. So the conditions are not great and the pay is terrible. But this was considered a good job in town. So it shows you how desperate the economic times were in that town. And the other thing, and again, Howard mentioned this, and I'll just elaborate a little. This is a town with a great deal of racial segregation still. We're talking about rural North Carolina, 1991. Now, people who don't know the history or don't know much about rural North Carolina, and some of our teachers are probably coming from rural communities, people on the outside might think, oh, well, we have the Civil Rights Act and everything's kumbaya and everything's integrated and everyone lives together and it's all wonderful. No, frankly, it's not true today. I hope most of us know that. And certainly 30 years ago, it was not true in rural towns like Hamlet, North Carolina. It was still it may not have been legally segregated, but it was highly segregated in terms of where people lived, where they worshiped, where they shopped, the work they did, the opportunities that were available. Remember that most of the people that were killed or badly injured were African American, most of them women, younger women, often single moms. I mean, these were women under enormous economic pressure. So that's the kind of social and economic history of the town that you just have to sort of confront to understand sort of, if you'll pardon the pun, the stage on which this got played out. And Christie, you mentioned a couple of other points, and I agree with you, and I'll elaborate. One is this whole thing about deregulation. Enormous, starting in the 1970s and then accelerating in the 80s, there was this enormous sort of political push all over the country, but especially in the South, to deregulate. And the idea was we want to attract businesses to North Carolina. Doesn't really matter what business. And in fact, North Carolina there's almost a tale of two North Carolinas, as there often is. If you look at the Triangle and the Research Triangle Park, we were attracting more and more higher tech industry, computers, biopharma, all that stuff, which often pays fairly well. I mean, those are jobs for educated people, often with graduate degrees that pay good salaries. But in rural North Carolina, again, very different story. The textile mills were disappearing, and there was a kind of desperate move of, can we find other jobs? And food processing was one of them. And chicken processing, hog slaughtering, has set up enormous facilities in rural North Carolina. And again, the goal was, if you're going to get those businesses here, you have to make it quote unquote business friendly, which means you cut back on safety regulation, environmental regulation, building codes, all kinds of things. And in fact, in Hamlet, I would argue it was even worse, because what you have there is, in Hamlet, you have an operation that's almost running outside of any regulation. I mean, when they finally did investigations after the fire, they discovered this was a business that seemed to have almost no licenses to even operate. So it wasn't just deregulating, it was literally on the outskirts of town, and literally sort of on the outskirts of any kind of regulation. And again, that just adds to the sad story of, when you completely deregulate and when you let businesses operate without any regulation, you really are skating on very thin ice, and bad things often happen in a deregulated environment. And the final point is simply, yes, North Carolina has a very long history of being hostile to unions. Christie knows I do a lot of teacher workshops, and that's what I talk about. So we can do that again sometime. But
teachers know.
I have to boil down an entire hour PowerPoint into about 1 minute. But just real quickly to say, yes, this state has a history going back a century or more of being hostile to unions for a number of different reasons, partly because of the nature of our industries, partly because unions in the middle of the 20th century were seen as a way to improve the lives of Black folk, and the white power structure didn't want that. That was challenging their power and their racial prerogatives. So the fact is, today we have about 3% of our workforce is organized into unions in this state. We usually battle South Carolina for the lowest. We're either the 49th or the 50th, depending on the year you look at the data. And so there was no union in Hamlet. There was no union in that chicken plant. There are some chicken and hog processing plants in this state that do have a union. The largest hog processing plant in the state, down in Tar Heel, does have a union. It took them almost 20 years to win 3 different union elections, and there's a terrific book on that story too that we could read sometime. No, Hamlet's the story of very vulnerable, very exploited, mainly African-American women who don't have any union protection, have almost no regulatory protection. Just one final point I'll add, Howard mentioned this, but he's correct. In that plant, there were inspectors there almost every day from the Department of Agriculture to make sure the meat wasn't spoiled or tainted, though there are actually stories of them processing some probably nearly spoiled meat, which is a whole nother thing. They were trying to sneak it by the USDA inspectors. But there was never anyone from the Department of Labor or from OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and no one from the state. And the agriculture inspectors kept saying, well, we kind of thought some things didn't look really good for the workers, but that's not our job. We're not supposed to report that. Who would we report it to? We work for the Department of Agriculture. So again, sort of failure on top of failure on top of failure. And 25 people lost their lives that shouldn't have.
And I actually read somewhere that the owner of this plant moved from Pennsylvania, where he had been fined multiple times up in Pennsylvania, and he chose North Carolina specifically because of the lenient laws, that he came here particularly for that reason.
Yes, he came here for the 2 reasons we just discussed. It was seen as quote unquote business friendly, i.e. little to no regulation and no unions. And remember, North Carolina has always sold that. You can go back to the 1890s. In our state archives are flyers that the State Department of Labor distributed back in the 1890s saying, bring your business to North Carolina. Cheap land, cheap labor, docile labor, no unions. That's been a selling point for North Carolina for more than 100 years. That's something that's, and it's frankly, it's been promoted by both Democratic and Republican administrations.
Right.
Up until fairly recently, with a few exceptions, most North Carolina Democrats were, if not anti-union, sort of lackadaisical.
Right.
And I think that was a huge mistake they made politically and economically. But again, that could probably be a whole nother lecture.
There are many lectures in this.
Absolutely. I got 1,000 of them. Just wind me
I'm
up.
going to do a David Zonderman series. But it's a really important point because, just in the presidential debate, we're now into early voting in North Carolina. You heard talk of deregulation. And so this is would you say, repercussion of what deregulation can look like? Do we have a state still today that favors businesses over workers, would you say?
Yes, and I'd also say people who talk, the word deregulation is one of those buzzwords that certain people love to use, and they'll always say it's good for business. Well, I would give two answers to that. One is even businesses, there's a long history. In fact, there's some terrific books that came out almost 50 years ago about, you can go back 100 years ago or more to the so-called progressive era. And if you look back at the progressive era, one of the groups that actually wanted some regulation, not all, but some, were certain business groups. Because in the unregulated economic community, they were cutting each other's throats and killing each other off. So deregulation, again, it's a word that sort of people all go, oh yeah, it's great, and we hate the government getting us off our back, and businesses will thrive. But it's really a question of what regulation are we talking about? Do we really want no regulation for safety in the workplace? Do we really want no regulation for clean air or clean water in a world of massive climate change, which is a reality, I would argue, even though I'm not a climate scientist. I read the scientists. Do we really want to, deregulate, all of our banks the way we did back in the 1990s, and then we had the massive collapse of 2008? So, deregulation is one of those words I always encourage my students to think, what are we exactly deregulating? Who wants the deregulation? What's going to be the impact on sort of the average man or woman, whether it's at the workplace, in the air we breathe, in the economy as a whole? Deregulation often is much more complex and has all kinds of bad consequences that we don't always want to talk about.
Right. And one last follow-up, Patrick from Duplin County is asking, were there any changes made in policy in regards to labor laws, specifically in North Carolina, following this tragedy? I know Howard mentioned, a settlement of around $800K, and that perhaps there was some legislation that changed after that. But did people pay attention to this? Did some change kind of roll in after this horrific incident?
Yeah, what happened was, I would say, a kind of familiar story. The year immediately following, in the state legislature, there was a lot of talk. I mean, it's pretty hard to ignore a fire when 25 people die. And there was a lot of sort of legislative churning and debating, a lot of, you might call, laboring and bringing forth a mouse. There were some modest changes in state workplace safety law. They weren't bad, and they tweaked some things. They were not what I would argue were sort of game changers. There was also an increase in the budget for state workplace inspectors. Again, probably not as much as there should have been, but some. The then director of the state occupational safety group resigned, and the new guy, and I'm sorry to say I'm now forgetting his name, turned out to be pretty good. And in fact, he was so good, he later was tapped by, I believe it was the Clinton administration, to go to Washington and head up the national OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. And there was a new Secretary of Labor in the state. That was Harry Payne, who ran the Department of Labor for many years and had a reputation of being a sort of a guy who looked at research and statistics and wanted to improve the enforcement of labor law. So I would say modest changes, not as many as there should have been, but not surprisingly, the business community pushed back a lot and said, oh, let's not get overboard, let's not be drastic, blah, blah, blah. So
we'll come back to that.
Sure.
Joanna, I want to bring you into this conversation now. You know, you've done a lot of research on meat processing plants. I would love for you to talk to us a little bit more. David kind of got into this a bit about what this work is actually like, that people are doing for minimum wage. You know, let's remember again, as we've said, 30 years ago in Hamlet, they were doing this work for around $5 an hour. Today, you know, 30 years later, wow, it's up to $7.25 an hour. So we've $2, you know, $2 up on minimum wage over the past 30 years. That's a whole other program, David. But what do we need to know about this industry overall? And were the conditions in Hamlet unique, or is this just, we got a glaring view at what conditions are like in most of these plants?
Thank you for those questions, Christie, and thank you, Howard and David, for what you've said so far. I'm feeling a lot of resonances with what you're saying, and I'll pick up on a lot of similar themes. So sadly, I wish I could say things have really improved or that the Imperial Food plant was an exception, but that's just not what the research shows. In the last 20 or 30 years, things have certainly shifted. And I don't think that we'll see another tragedy precisely like the one that took place in Hamlet, where there was such a blatant disregard for fire code and absolute lack of government oversight. But in terms of the exploitation and intimidation of workers that laid the groundwork for that fire, not a lot has changed. So, as was certainly the case at the time of the Hamlet fire, meat processing is simply physically and emotionally grueling work. There are very few breaks. Those breaks are very tightly monitored, and workers typically need to stand still for their entire day at their station on the line, doing repetitive motions, often with a knife. The floor is slippery, the smell is overwhelming, the sound of machinery can be deafening and make conversation impossible. And so workers report all sorts of physical ailments that can sometimes even begin to develop within the first week at work. So these can be things like hands going numb, fingernails falling off. Many people develop repetitive stress injuries that make it unbearable for them to do just basic day-to-day things like turn a doorknob or pick up their own child or sleep through the night without pain. But because workers are discouraged so intensely from reporting these injuries, and because they know they will probably lose their jobs if they do report them, many of them simply push through the pain, which then means that major accidents are only more prone to happen. And I do want to pause here and stress that there are still some smaller plants out there to whom these generalizations don't necessarily apply, plants where there are just a few dozen workers who are switching on and off of tasks, rotating through jobs throughout the week. But over the last few decades, larger plants have almost entirely succeeded in pushing those smaller ones completely out of business. So in fact, actually, the Imperial Foods plant seems tiny compared to what we see today. Howard told us it had about 215 employees. The Butterball plant in Duplin County has over 3,000. Wow. That's a chicken plant today. So it's exactly the same model at work, but just scaled up dramatically.
Yeah.
And I would say perhaps the most important thing about this industrial model for folks to understand is that it completely centers on the disassembly line. So animals are killed, they're sent down essentially on a conveyor belt, and each person standing along that line has one task that they perform again and again. So maybe I'm deboning chicken as it flies by, and Christie, you're deveining. But however fast those birds come, we need to keep up with it. And in plants nowadays, there are actually buttons around the building that you can push in case of an emergency to stop the line. But workers report that it is just understood that you should never, ever hit that button, because the moment you hit it, the company starts to lose money. So what this means is that workers are effectively trapped on the line. And the consequences of this range from small to large, but they all reflect just an absolute denial of the dignity and respect that these workers are owed. So for example, there are tons of cases where workers have been denied bathroom breaks and they soil themselves, or menstruating women are bleeding through their clothes as they stand at the line and are forced to keep working. Of course, there are many instances of workers getting injured and the line not stopping. And in fact, one scholar who worked at Smithfield's pork plant in Tar Heel, the one that David mentioned, about 10 years ago, described how in the time that she worked there, 2 different workers died during the workday. One suffocated from inhaling methane fumes, and another had a heart attack. And in neither of those deaths was the line stopped. So clearly, on an industrial scale, this is a system where workers are plugged in like elements of a machine, and their very basic human needs are denied. And this is not even saying anything about the ways in which they're denied time off for things like funerals or childcare or medical appointments. And it's, of course, worth saying out loud, these are not interchangeable workers. Even within the context of the plant, many of these workers are extremely skilled, have been doing their jobs for a long time, and take enormous pride in their work. But they're having to do that work within a system that is designed to treat them as disposable. And I would say this disavowal of the basic humanity of workers is just undeniably inflected with race and with class. What we see at many plants is still largely white management, with many or most even of the workers on the floor being people of color and immigrants. And there's been huge evidence brought forward over the past decades showing some processing plants actually showing preferential hiring practices towards undocumented immigrants, specifically because that immigration status is a vulnerability that they can manipulate, a tool to leverage in discouraging workers from protesting poor working conditions or even from reporting medical issues. So I think precisely the same kind of dynamics of worker intimidation that we see taking place at the Hamlet plant are still routine in the industry today.
You just answered a question. Lisa from Wake was asking whether undocumented workers or language barriers played a role in Hamlet with workers not reporting conditions. You know, my understanding is that in Hamlet in 1991, those are all folks, those were Richmond County folks, you know, in areas around there, born and bred, but there does seem to be a transition today where we have plants even recruiting undocumented workers for the very reasons that you're talking about, that somewhere along the line that kind of transitioned for the reasons that you've highlighted. Yeah.
Which seems very strategic, and it seems in keeping with what I would say is probably the biggest change in the industry since 1991, which is just the continued consolidation of meat processing into fewer and larger plants. And in those fewer and larger plants, they've come to take on a kind of bloated political power. And so as David mentioned, I mean, in the wake of the Hamlet fire in North Carolina, deregulation, I think, was rightly in many ways blamed for the tragedy, and there were some initial efforts to increase regulation. But what I want to point to is not just how short-lived those efforts at regulation were, but how quickly they were co-opted by the industry itself. So over the past few decades, meat plants have really slowly accumulated this power to self-regulate, and I think strategic choices like hiring folks where there's going to be a language barrier kind of feed into that system. So this self-regulation is allowing a kind of exploitation to go on under the surface. So for example, I talked a minute ago about the way the disassembly line runs, with workers needing to keep pace with the speed of the line. Now, previously, the government put limitations on how fast that line could go. And that was, you know, in a tiny bit to protect workers, but it was mostly about food safety. We only have money for so many inspectors. They need to be able to see every carcass as it passes by. We can't afford to make the line go faster. But just this past fall, the pork industry struck a deal with the USDA. And within this new arrangement, as long as pork plants promise to train their own workers to inspect meat, they can run the line as fast as they can. So the cap has been completely lifted. And what does that mean for workers? It means they are expected simply to speed up their work to match the line. So these industry lobbying efforts have shaped regulations not to protect workers and not to protect consumers, but in fact to protect the meat industry giants themselves against legal liability when things go wrong. And this has been so amplified during the pandemic. So plants have not only been allowed to stay open during outbreaks, but they have been allowed to opt out of certain health guidelines that would interrupt productivity, basically that would slow down the line speed. So this spring, OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, told meat plants that as long as they followed safety guidelines, if feasible, and made a good faith effort, they would be protected against litigation. And unsurprisingly, this has happened. So in America, about 500 plants have had outbreaks of COVID-19. And in those plants, over 200 workers have died. And only 2 plants have been issued citations for this. Those 2 plants, incidentally, are 2 of the biggest ones, Smithfield and JBS, which took in a combined $70 billion of revenue last year. And for the 10 worker deaths, they were given a citation and a fine of less than $30,000.
Wow.
So if we break that down, that is less than $3,000 for each worker's life. And that is the regulatory system working as they have set it up. But if that's the price tag that we are putting on workers' lives, less than $3,000, then we have really not moved the needle very far since the Hamlet fire.
Mm. You know, what you said reminds me of a quote I read from David Seegers, who's the Secretary of Food and Commercial Workers at Local 442 in Georgia. Mm-hmm. And, you know, he was talking about the meatpacking industry, and he says it's one of the dirtiest jobs there is. While the days of legal slavery are over, I'm not sure it's over in regard to the poultry industry. These people put up with more abuse than any other industry. And it sounds from what you're saying that your research would agree with that.
It would. Wage slavery is the phrase that keeps coming up here. Yeah.
Yeah. You know, Howard, she said something I want to ask you about. You know, she was talking about kind of the abysmal conditions and the breaks, you know, again, back to Hamlet, where we have women, you know, being the majority of workers. And I know you specifically looked into the break process in Hamlet. And what was it, 5 minutes you could go? Was it 4 times a day for 5 minutes? And if you went over 5 minutes, you got a demerit or whatever they called it.
They had 4 minutes would have been a blessing. They got 2 5-minute bathroom breaks and a lunch.
Mm.
And you know, and so Joanna's absolutely right. That happened in Hamlet, where people would, you know, couldn't get to the bathroom, would have to deal with that, deal with other issues. You know, you just couldn't say, you know, I need to, you know, my cycle started, I need to, you couldn't leave the line or you lose your job.
Right.
And so in that particular plant, they were standing around in, you know, like 1 to 2 inches of water on the floor with all the slime and that type of thing. People, your hands would get so numb. In the research, there were stories where people would cut themselves and not even know it till they got home and their hands actually thawed out and then started bleeding profusely. Problems with their wrists, corporal tunnel, I think is what it's called, very prevalent. Health insurance, what they had was so bad that most people wouldn't take it because it would take all of their check and wouldn't cover anything.
Again, a whole other program when you talk about
a whole nother thing, but you know, it goes back, you know, Brian Simon explains it well in his book. He talks about reverse Fordism, you know, the idea that instead of, you know, I guess with the Ford example, you pay the worker a decent wage so that the worker can in turn afford to buy the product. It kind of, you know, and, you know, middle class of Detroit kind of comes from, Michigan, you know, kind of sprouts from that kind of model. But the reverse of that is if we can have this, what we consider disposable labor, that we can pay absolutely nothing. If we can mass produce the cheapest product that we can, then we can get more people to buy it and we can have a larger bottom line. And that's basically what was happening. One of the things that affected me in writing the play and that I tried to bring out in the piece is that we often put a distance between our personal lives and this type of thing, but we have to understand that in a way we're all complicit. Right. You know, when you go to the grocery store and, you know, if you travel outside of the United States, you get an understanding of how expensive meat really is and what people pay in other places on this planet. And there is a price that is paid in human lives when you can get, you know, a pack of chicken for $2, right? There's a price that comes with the cheapness, and that price is paid by the workers, and in the end also by the consumer, because of the, you know, we can do a whole thing on a whole nother series on
I'm writing them down.
how healthy, you know, the food is that we're getting, and the reasons, you know, all of the stuff that's going on there. But that's a whole nother thing, you know, just in terms of that. But the short answer to your question is that the working conditions were absolutely horrible.
And imagine being pregnant, you know, if any of you
pregnant,
are pregnant, and I'm sure things did not change for them. But
Not
you know,
right.
hearing you guys talk, it also makes me think about our legislators, you know, and the folks making the laws. And I would wager that most of them are very removed from what the reality is like for low wage earners, right? Like if you think about the amount of money and social capital it takes to run for office, to get elected. So the disconnect between our lawmakers and the reality of what these folks are doing for today, $7.25 an hour, then, you know, $5.25 an hour, I think could be part of this too. But again, you know, Howard, taking us back to the individual stories and what that experience is like on an individual level. And again, I think that's what's so powerful about your play. And so I'm wondering if you would be willing to share an excerpt from your play with us, just to kind of recenter us on those stories.
So how I put the play together was basically with two ideas. I wanted to get as much information out about what actually happened during the event. And at the same time, I wanted to go inside into how this would play out in people's lives. And so part of the play is designed as a documentary in a way where the actor comes out and speaks as if they are doing a documentary. And then those monologues are fit in between scenes where we follow a group of workers throughout the play. So what I'm going to share is and what that did, it also allowed me to look at the event in real time, or in other words, you know, dramatize what was happening when this was happening, and then also dramatize the response to what happened from different family members, investigators, the mayor, you know, different characters, so we could see kind of before the fire, during the fire, and then the aftermath. And so the little monologue I'll share with you is the son of one of the women who died in the plant, talking about this. The play was written around the 25th anniversary. And so part of what is going on in the play with the documentaries, people have come back to Sullivan, aka Hamlet, to talk to survivors about the event in the 25 years following. So that's the setup.
And I think it's worth mentioning before you start, my understanding is that 56 children had a parent killed or severely injured that day on September 3rd, 1991.
A lot of orphans, and that's a whole nother story. You could write 4 plays, sadly, about the tragedy. I mean, the racial dynamics, you know, how many lives could have been saved if the police chief had of, you know, allowed the Black Fire Department to get involved, which he blocked. I mean, it's just so many layers and layers upon layers upon layers. And, you know, we tried to address as many of those as we could in about 2-hour time span. But, you know, I would definitely say that for me right now, the best book that has been written on that is Brian Simon's book, because it goes into great detail of every aspect of how this happened. So I would definitely encourage people who are interested in this, and even if you're not, just so you know what's going on in your own country, to take a look at Brian's book. So this is from the son of a survivor talking to the documentarian. and his name is John. And so I'll just read a little stage direction, and then I'll read the short monologue. Documentary area, John Crutchfield. The image of a garage is projected on the screen. John sits holding a wrench. He wears greasy overalls and is in an equally greasy baseball cap pulled down low. John. I'd appreciate it if y'all didn't refer to me as Jay Boogie in the film. I know that's what's on the sign. I used to be a DJ around here. Folk know me by that, so that's why it's Jay Boogie Auto Repair. But this here film is real serious, you know, real serious matter. So I'm John Crutchfield, Southern High School, class of '92. I lost my mother, Lily Jean Crutchfield, in the Monarch Plant Fire 25 years ago next week. Takes a breath, reflect a pause. I was happy Mama hadn't gotten home on time that afternoon. I hadn't taken a hamburger meat out of the freezer. See, my job after school was to make sure my little brother and sister did their homework and take out whatever Mama was gonna cook if it needed to be thawed out. I've been on the phone talking to my girlfriend and hadn't done it. You know, black mamas don't play that. They tell you to take something out of the freezer and they come home and you ain't done it. Well, that's a surefire way to get your butt in the sling. Ain't easy to get out of. And Mama was never in a good mood when she come home from that place. So like I said, I was glad she hadn't gotten home. Maybe that meat would thaw out a little, give me time to come up with a good lie. I had the meat in the sink running hot water over it. It was after 5. I know that because my little brother and sister had just finished watching Power Rangers in the den and I could hear the news come on. I heard something about Monarch Foods and then the phone rang. My cousin Dennis asking me if Mama was home. Told me he heard the plant was on fire. Shelton's a small town. So I dropped the phone, left the water on and ran over to the plant. Told my brother and sisters to just stay in the house. When I saw the fire trucks and ambulances and smoke, I knew I wasn't gonna see my mama again. So I stopped running and I just sat down on the curb and cried. I want people to know that the main reason I agreed to be in this here film is because for the last 25 years, I've been asking myself, why my mama? Why anybody's mama have to die like that? And if my being in this helps to answer that question, I got to do my part. And most mainly, I don't want folk to forget the peoples who died. They had families and things to do in this world. We do a lot of forgetting in this country. I tell my story for the memory. And so the play is a mixture between these type of monologues and the actually following of the workers in the plant. And another thing that we did is we casted the play with all women playing both male and female roles, just to emphasize the impact on the women who worked in that plant, and the majority of who, you know, the mothers, the 18 mothers, the 18 women who died there.
Right. When you said that line struck me so much. We do a lot of forgetting in this country. Every history teacher listening just said amen, because we do a lot of forgetting in this country. It's very powerful. Davis from Jackson County is asking, Howard, through all your research, was there any individual or particular story of the people impacted that most sticks with you or haunts you, or maybe even gives you some kind of hope? It's probably a tough one to answer.
It's so many stories, but you know, I think about and I think of many of the people and you know, I think of the workers kind of as one character because of what they do afterwards, you know, how the community comes together. And, you know, part of the history a lot of people don't know is that after the building burned down, they left it up for several years, you know, and it was right across the street from where many of the workers lived. And so every day their children, their loved ones are driving past the scene of the crime. Kids are playing in the broken glass and the burnt down, you know, buildings, and parents are running them out of there. And then they had to actually get politicians involved to get that torn up years later. The fear being that if we don't handle this just right, with just the right amount of kid gloves, then we won't be able to get businesses to come back. And that thinking, you know, kept that death trap up for years, which is what it was after it was all burnt in. It was while it was running, but why it wasn't. So one story, like I said, there's so many stories, but I often think about the vending machine guy. Who was a guy, and I apologize for not having his name right at the top of my memory, but I'll never forget his story. He was just a guy that came to restock the vending machines, right? And I believe, if I'm correct, on that day, he wasn't even supposed to be there. He was covering from somebody. And he just went in and restacked the vending machines. And they didn't even know he had died until the vending machine company couldn't find out where the truck was. And then they saw the truck in the parking lot on the news. So that was one story. The story of the guy who kicked down the door and ends up, damaging his leg, for the rest of his life, but is able to kick that door open. And how many lives did he save? I think about the roles and how do they live with themselves after this? It's as was said earlier, I don't think they intended for the plant to burn down, but they didn't care enough to consider that it could, and the fact that, and we touched on this earlier, that they came to North Carolina on purpose. They had a plant in Georgia that also caught fire. They came to the South on purpose because they basically ran them out of the North with labor unions and regulations. And so, and then the research shows how nasty that Mr. Rowe was between about any talk of union, anything. And I bring that out in the play. And that was one of the quickest, the only thing probably will get you fired quicker in that plant than stopping the line was mentioning the word union. And so, but in short, that would be, the story that sticks out the most to me. I just think about, all the people that died, but, just how, and this isn't necessarily about Imperial Foods, but just about life in general, how you just never know. Right. That guy just went in to put some chips in the machine and go home, right. And then he ends up in a fireball, and how does his family, and just the randomness of this human experience that we have. But as I said earlier, this is an experience that did not have to happen. And I hope that if anything, people remember about this, that is the thing that they, keep in mind.
And the horrific idea that someone would lock fire exits from the outside because it was alleged, not even proven, alleged that chicken was being stolen. So you have, just to imagine, Sue Coe has an incredible piece of art that she did about this plant that kind of, where she imagines the inside as the fire kind of rages through. But you have a fire that, this fireball, and people go to the emergency exits and imagine that moment when it won't open because it's been locked from the outside. And I know you mentioned running to the loading dock, thinking, we can get out there. And unfortunately, there's a tractor trailer backed up in there. And so you get in, but then the smoke pours in. I do remember reading that, I guess somewhat thankfully, the driver was in the cab and pulled out when he heard the screaming and the banging. But by that point, several bodies tumbled out because, the asphyxiation from the smoke, if the fire didn't get you, that was so severe too. So it's really just, there's so many pieces of this story, I think, that are really just horrific, made more so by the fact, like, as you said, it didn't have to happen. So, David, Trayvon from Durham is asking, who's to blame for this? If we cast blame, who gets the blame? Because I've heard a lot of possibilities in this conversation so far. Who's responsible?
Oh, sadly, as often happens in history and often with tragedies, there's more than enough blame to go around. Certainly the owners deserve a great deal of blame. And as, again, Howard mentioned, they struck a plea deal. The father served some modest amount of time in jail to get the son off so that he did not do any jail time. I think the state regulators and state legislators bear some some blame, because creating a so-called business-friendly climate that's openly hostile to workers and their interests, to me, I've always argued the smart way to do things is to balance. I mean, it obviously doesn't do a state or anybody any good to drive away all business. People need jobs, and not everyone can have their own business. So I'm not anti-business. And that's one of the problems in this country, is when you say you're pro-work or pro-labor, people assume, well, you hate business.
Yeah.
So I'm like, no.
We know you're a socialist communist, David.
Right. Workers
know about
need
you.
businesses and businesses need workers. So can't we find a way to develop regulatory regimes that understand that and sort of give everybody a fair shake and understand power dynamics and power differentials? Certain people do need more protection than others. So I think the regulators, the legislators, from the governor on down, this is a time of Governor Hunt, who in some areas was very progressive. He certainly, as most of us are educators on this in this event, he has a strong record of being a strong proponent for public education. I give him tremendous thanks and credit for that. But he was sort of caught up in, we got to get business to North Carolina, and if you want business, you got to make businesses know you love business and you're pro-business, and that means as little regulation as possible. And again, I would just challenge that argument. I think there are both human costs. I mean, Hamlet is an example of people die when you have no decent regulation. But beyond that, there are sensible ways to do it. I mean, I come back to what I said earlier about, the words deregulation get a lot of people like jumping up and down and hooping it up. But regulation is not an inherently evil, bad word. It's what are you regulating? Why are you regulating? How much regulation? To what end? I think all those are very legitimate questions to ask, rather than just saying, oh, I hate regulation. No regulation whatsoever. And I'll just make, if you don't mind, I just want to add one other point about, Howard made a point about the doors being locked and trying to, break them open. I believe I'm correct that in the Smithsonian now is one of the doors from Hamlet, and there are blackened boot prints on that door showing where people tried to kick it open. And I also happen to be a museum person, so I believe very much in the power of physical objects. And boy, talk about a powerful physical object that conveys again, it tells a story of desperation and sadness and tragedy. And it literally makes the hair on what hair I have left, it makes it stand up to think about what it must be like to be trapped and suffocate in a condition like that. It truly makes you want to cry.
It's unimaginable.
Real quick, I like to say something else about the doors real quickly too, that shouldn't be missed. And that is that the workers were aware that the doors were locked. The workers were there the 3 times that the boiler almost blew up. So you also have to imagine being trapped in an economic situation so bad that you could possibly die at work, but you still have to go for $5.25 an hour. And that's the part of the story we can't miss.
That's right.
Yes, and I would add then that, and this comes back to something Joanna said too, it's one of the many strange and painful ironies about our economic system, and it's not unique to the United States, although I would say it's heightened in this country, is that many of our, to be blunt, worst jobs also pay the worst wages. You would think if there was an ounce of justice in this, a job that most people looked and said, oh my goodness, I don't want to do that, would actually pay a little more, because we'd recognize, hey, this is a miserable job. Let's at least pay people a decent wage to do a miserable job. But think about the people who take away our waste, the people who are cutting our grass in July when it's 100 degrees. I did that to make money for college, but that was a long time ago. It wasn't my career. In fact, it's one of the reasons that convincing me to go to college is I don't want to do that as a career. But as we've talked about, people don't always, people think, oh, everyone has choices. This is easy. What's the matter with you? You don't have to work in that place. Well, again, I absolutely agree with what Howard said. In many of these small communities, it's not like there's 50 other decent jobs and you just decide to do this crummy one for crummy wages. It's actually the best of all options. So you can imagine how terrible the other options are.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
you got to combine, it's this, again, pardon the terrible pun, it's this toxic combination of terrible working conditions, low wages, and again, Joanna, you mentioned this, often the most vulnerable workforce. Very often people with legal status in question. So they know, in fact, there was a Supreme Court case, and I'm trying to remember the year of it, I don't remember, but it was probably around this time, where the Supreme Court said illegal immigrants cannot, are, if you complain about your working conditions, that can still make you vulnerable to deportation. You're not excused from deportation actions. So, and people with questionable legal status learn that by word of mouth. Just keep your mouth shut, because if you speak up, you could lose your job, or worse yet, the ICE will come and take you away. So, and the companies that hire them know that. They know these are people we can pretty much do anything we want to, and they won't say anything because they're afraid. So it's all bundled together. It's not a coincidence. It's all put together.
It's really interesting too, this issue of choice. Okay, well, you had the choice to work there, to not work there, but did they really? It makes me think of Loretta Goodwin, who Howard mentioned earlier, who you saw in the intro. She was one of the survivors from the Hamlet fire. She's born into a family of 16, incredibly hard worker, but she left school in 10th grade, one, because her family needed money to care for her siblings, and two, she said her teachers didn't pay her any attention because, quote, if your mother wasn't rich, you got overlooked in school. So she had completely lost interest and she needed money. 43 years old, she's working at Imperial in these conditions for $5 an hour to take care of her own family. And, and she's trying to, go to school at night to be a nurse to better herself. But then she goes through this fire and since then has been unwell, has nightmares and night terrors, a long list of, as Howard says, the conditions that folks are dealing with, from blindness to, lung disease, are incredible. And I think about her and I think, did she have a choice? When there's no other work in your town, is that really a choice? And I don't know that we can call that a choice. Joanna, did you want to add anything to who is to blame, who is culpable? I know Howard, you said we all are, if you really think about it. What are your thoughts, Joanna?
Yeah, so to build on what Howard said, and as well as what he was just describing about how folks can get really trapped in these low-paying jobs, I think it's a sign of a broken food system where we have these terrible jobs that are exploitative conditions in order to create artificially cheap meat. And then we point to the wages those folks are earning and say, well, that's evidence that we need to have cheap meat, because otherwise what else are these people going to be able to afford to eat? And so the cycle continues. I was reading something this morning that was statistically tracking meat consumption in the US, and it showed that from 1960 to 2020, chicken consumption specifically has more than tripled. And that's because of these artificially low prices, because if that's what you can afford to eat, you're going to eat more of it. With my research focusing on this contemporary moment, I'm really struck by how during the pandemic, we all realized what a stranglehold the meat industry had. There was a shocking moment where the CEO of Smithfield, one of these meat giants, when confronted by several senators about a failure to take proper COVID safety precautions, he said, and I quote, "Our plants are what they are. Like, take them or leave them. This is what they are." And that gives the false impression, as Howard and David have both touched on already, that this system is inevitable, that this is the only way it could be. And so I think it's really difficult to assign blame, but that any possible solution has to involve a cultural shift away from valuing profit over life, profit over basic human happiness.
Yeah, it's interesting. You guys, go ahead, David.
Well, I'm just going to add to what Joanna said. I think I'll add two things. One is, as a historian, this system has been around for more than 100 years. Meat packing plants being dangerous, brutal work, low wages, often a large immigrant workforce. I would argue the plants today, with some modifications in technology, but probably not a lot, are not much different than when Upton Sinclair wrote about more than 100 years ago in the jungle. I mean, it's an industry that in many ways has not just the way they look, but simply the way they basically operate and the people that are employed in them and how they're treated. So there's a long history to this. And I would add also this debate about, are we all implicated in this world of cheap labor, is another argument. I know historians, we love to sort of quote our own books. So in the book I wrote about labor reform in Boston, back at the turn of the 20th century was the beginnings of what's called the Consumer League movement. And the Consumer Leagues were very popular all the way through the 20th century. And one of the things they talked about was they were some of the first ones to talk about potential consumer boycotts. And several of the people who led the Consumer Leagues wrote about, literally they called it the high cost of cheapness. So that's not a new phrase. In fact, it was used back around 1900, a little earlier actually, in the 1890s. A man by the name of John Graham Brooks wrote about it, saying, in effect, we're all implicated in this. And when you, the consumer, and he often addressed women, when you, the woman shopper, go into the department store, if you are buying the cheaper, blouse to wear, think about the cost of that. Why is it cheap? It's cheap because the women that sew it are getting paid, sub-minimum. There wasn't such a thing as a minimum wage. That wasn't established until the 1930s, but they're getting less than a living wage. I mean, again, these terms are not new. As a historian, I can tell you this debate is quite old. But again, coming back to that word about forgetting, we forget these sometimes and we act like we've just discovered them. And as a historian, I want to scream, it's not new. You think this just emerged in 2020. Go back to 1920. Go back to 1890. We've been discussing these over and over again. So, and the other thing I'll say is we've all become sort of used to cheapness. And I'm troubled by it on two levels. One is because we pay so many people such lousy wages, we force them into buying cheap because they can't afford anything else. But there's also lots of middle-class people that can afford to pay more, but don't want to. I call it the Walmart syndrome. My wife and I do not shop at Walmart because they are a notoriously anti-union company. If you mention the word union in a Walmart, they literally have teams they send out from Bentonville, Arkansas, all over the country, and they will shut down whole units of a store because somebody said the U word. They are maniacal. So I want nothing to do with Walmart. But we have friends who are just like us, upper middle class, professional people. They make a decent living. They could go to a store where something costs 5 cents more. Oh, but Walmart's cheap. You get a great deal. And my wife and I just, we try to have civil conversations. I try to say to them in almost so many words, you can afford to pay a little more. Go to another, go to Costco. Costco actually often has unionized people. Kroger has unionized people in their grocery store. So, yeah, you may pay 5 cents more for the box of cereal. You can afford it. Now, if you're making minimum wage, you may not be able to actually afford the 5 or 10 cents more per product. And those are the people who are really trapped. They're trapped into exploiting themselves and other underpaid workers. But middle-class people could actually break that cycle. If more of us said to Walmart, we're not going to shop at your store because you treat workers like dirt and you're so rabidly anti-union. In fact, a lot of workers who work at Walmart end up going on things like we used to call it food stamps, or Medicaid. So our tax dollars are subsidizing Walmart to pay people lousy wages and not give them benefits. And I'm sorry, I'm done with that. I know I'm ranting here, but that's just an example of we are complicit. And I think particularly for those of us that make decent wages, we could easily break out of the cycle of cheap just by saying, I'm willing to go and shop somewhere else and pay a little more. again, I'll just give just one other quick example. It's both a historical and a personal example. I'm old enough to remember the grape and the lettuce boycotts of the late 1960s, early 1970s. And I remember as a kid going grocery shopping with my dad. I'm the youngest of three boys. He'd round us all up on a Saturday morning, so my mother would have an hour or two of peace and quiet, and we'd all go to the grocery store. And when I got to be old enough, about 10 or 12, I was always a kid that asked questions, and why are those people standing outside the store? My dad would explain they don't want us to buy that kind of lettuce. And so I'd say to my dad, well, then let's not buy it. Let's buy that other one. He'd say, well, it costs a nickel more. And I'd say, but we have enough money. We're not poor. And my father would go, well, it's not your nickel, it's my nickel. So, we went back and forth, but I was already trying to argue with my dad, who, again, we weren't rich people, we were middle class, but it was like, you can afford the extra nickel for the lettuce. And that's, I think, the message we need to get out to at least middle class consumers, is that we can get out of this cheapness. And in fact, to help the very workers who can't get out of the cheap products because they don't make enough. So I'll stop my sermon, but I think it's important to think about that.
Amen. And actually, you're answering some questions that we're getting. Dana from Wake is asking, what can we do? And I think you just answered that. She's asking, what role do we all play, including consumers, in improving working conditions? Cynthia from Orange County wants to know, how can we as citizens hold companies and businesses accountable? How do we push for safety guidelines to protect workers? What do we do? And I think you just gave with your ESP, one great answer there. Any other ideas, Joanna, based on your research, other thoughts on what can we do?
So just as a very basic first step, I think we need to get curious about where our food comes from. And this is a place where I see teachers as playing a really powerful role. I think, I was struck as well by that quote from the excerpt you read, Howard, about how much we forget. And I think the food industry in this country has become just so opaque. So many of us live our lives so removed from it. And just simply to take the step to educate ourselves about how many hands touch the food that we're buying, what goes into that price that we're paying, I think is a really important first step in starting to change things.
Right. And David, you mentioned unions, and we have several questions about, a teacher from Robertson County is asking, why are labor unions so weak in North Carolina, which you talked a little bit about earlier. I don't know if I would say weak, 3% of that, we have 3% unionization. I don't know if that's weak or barely non-existent, but are unions a solution to this, would you say?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say, just quickly to pick up on something Joanna said, we can do more as consumers, and Joanna probably knows even more about this than I do, but one of the things that we have seen the past few years is, of course, this push for organic foods, and this suspicion of GMO, which, as someone who believes in science, is actually somewhat questionable, but that's a whole nother debate. But, and Joanna, you may know this too, there's been some interesting research that unfortunately some of the major organic farms actually have terrible labor relations with their migrant farm workers. So we've got all these sort of yuppies in their Birkenstocks buying organic food, thinking they're doing wonderful things, but they've never asked about the labor conditions on the farms. Just, are the animals being treated better, which is important. I mean, I'm also like, give to the ASPCA, my dog is sitting right here. I don't want to see animals treated cruelly, but I also don't want to see the workers treated cruelly. So we can ask a lot more questions about that. Now, to the question of unions, yes, unions can absolutely play a role. People always should remember, two things. One is, let me just begin by saying, unions are not perfect. They're not the solution to everything. We've had a couple of recent stories, about various union corruption, which happens. Union leaders are not saints, they're not perfect. Some of them are fallen angels, just like in corporations, just like in religious organizations, just like in universities. There are bad actors, but overall, unions, a union that is well run and that is working for its members will fight for better wages, better benefits, and things like workplace safety. So, there are some slaughterhouses and food processing plants that are organized. Now, again, Joanna would probably know more about this than I do. The conditions are not perfect or fabulous. A unionized plant is not, they're not going to stop slaughtering hogs. They still do it. It's always going to be brutal, bloody work. A union's not going to stop that. But unions do fight for things like decent bathroom breaks, which we've already talked about. Is people might think that's trivial. It is not trivial. My goodness, I don't know about, I assume most of us listening in on this call can go to the bathroom when we need to most of the time. Think about a job where you literally end up soiling yourself because you can't get to the bathroom. Talk about undignified and degrading. So unions fight for basic workplace safety. They'll fight over the speed of a line. They'll fight to get various guards and protective equipment. Number of unions, particularly the United Food and Commercial Workers, have been battling all these plants throughout the past 6 months for protection against COVID-19. They haven't always won. And Joanna, as you said, I think one of the two big shocking things have happened in the past 6 months. One is how many outbreaks, and many of these plants just don't seem to care. And the other is how they've used this as an excuse to basically lobby the current federal government to eliminate most basic food safety and worker safety regulation. So the line speeds are running faster, which makes them more dangerous. This idea that a company's going to inspect its own meat, I don't know about you, but I confess I like a steak every now and then. I'm going to cook it even better. I'm worried about, what kind of creeping pathogens there will be if a company inspects it. That's why we have the USDA meat inspectors. The Meat Inspection Act, I believe, is somewhere around 1905, 1908, somewhere around there. It's an old law because before then, disgusting polluted meat was going into the market and people were getting sick and in some cases dying from food poisoning. So, I mean, again, it's the same thing with this deregulation. We forget in this country. Who needs regulation? We need regulation. We don't want to go back to the bad old days where you could open up, eat something for lunch and be dead by dinner. I mean, that's insane. So, but we tend to just think, oh, we don't need it, or it's all okay. We haven't had a problem in years. Why do we need regulation? People need to think the other way around. We don't have a problem because we do have regulation. It's not the other way around.
Yeah.
David, if I can jump in there really quickly, something I'm so struck with in what you said is about how many changes come about because of food safety issues instead of because of worker safety issues. And so when Upton Sinclair publishes The Jungle, what happens? There aren't these crazy changes to protect workers' rights. There are crazy changes to track food safety. We have the Hamlet fire in 91. And I believe it was 93 that there was the Jack in the Box E. coli outburst, which had a huge impact. Several children died, but it was the impact on the food that seemed to have more of a ripple effect through consumer markets than this tragedy at the Hamlet plant. And to me, again, that feels symptomatic of a cultural problem if we care a lot more about food safety than we do about worker safety.
Yes, I completely agree. In fact, you may remember Sinclair, I'm paraphrasing him, but he said something like, I meant to hit America in the stomach, and instead I hit it
in the heart, and I hit it in the stomach, yeah.
Yeah, that was it, in the heart instead of the stomach. And again, I'll make another analogy from my own research. Back in the 1890s, there was an effort to eliminate tenement house work, particularly making sweatshops, making garments, making like women's blouses and men's suits. And most of the arguments that were made were not that the working conditions were so horrible. It was the people are cramped and they're coughing on each other and giving diseases, and they're coughing into the clothing, and nice middle-class people will buy infected clothing and get sick. So there again, the argument that won the day in Congress was not, we need to do something for the poor workers. It's these workers are so unhealthy and sickly and dangerous. We have to prevent the consumers from getting infected by them. And so there's a long history of making these sort of consumer-based arguments rather than worker-based arguments. And, half of me says, look, any argument that wins and it's going to improve, that's good. But I agree with you. It's sad that in this country, if you start an argument with workers' rights, most people kind of yawn and go, oh, gee, too bad, so sad. And it comes back to what you said, Christie. It's this idea of they had a choice. They don't have to work there. They could get some other job. They're lazy, or they're not smart, or, it's their tough luck. I mean, we hear that over and over again, kind of blaming the victim.
Right. Well, and it makes us able to sleep easier at night, right? Like, it's much easier to see a homeless person and say, oh, well, they're lazy and on drugs, than actually that's a veteran who has post-traumatic stress syndrome. So, it's what you have to tell yourself to sleep at night. But I want to stay with this, some of these historical connections. Valencia, a teacher from Rockingham County, is saying, this incredible story, but where does this fit in the curriculum? How can I justify teaching my students about this? And, I'll just say, from my work, this connects to so many things, I feel like, especially for the teachers joining us who teach North Carolina history. There's a whole essential standard strand on economics, understanding the economic activities of North Carolina and the United States. This fits with that, and that's the same for our, U.S. history courses, and there's a personal financial literacy course. So I think anywhere economics is taught, this fits. I think it fits with teaching, about movements and civil rights and workers' rights as well. So I really encourage teachers to, we understand time is your biggest enemy, and you can only carve out so much time. That's just your biggest challenge. But I think this is so important in that it asks so many questions, just as I have a list of 10 programs that we're going to have to do after this one, just in this, brief conversation. So I think I really implore teachers to include this in your classes, and also make some connections. So Lois from Washington County is asking, are there comparisons between this event and the better known and perhaps more taught about in the curriculum Triangle Shirtwaist Company fire? Do you guys know anything about that? Maybe David, the historian, can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I don't want to hog the time. I'll just quickly say, yes, I think there are parallels. Hamlet happened about 80 years after Triangle Shirtwaist. And in fact, I believe Hamlet happened on the Tuesday after the Monday Labor Day. So there's a weird irony to that as well. Yes, I mean, things like exits being locked because the bosses thought workers were stealing products. Strong parallel right there. The fact that the majority of people that died were younger women. In the Triangle case, it was over 100 women died, and they were mostly teenagers, in fact, or young women in their early 20s, mainly immigrants, Italian and Eastern European Jews for the most part, and again, seen as a sort of exploitable, vulnerable workforce. And in fact, another parallel people sometimes make is Triangle was the worst fire in New York history until September 11th. And those terrible pictures of people jumping off the top of the World Trade Center, very similar thing happened at Triangle. The Triangle building still stands. It's now part of New York University. If anyone goes to Manhattan on vacation, it's right near Washington Square Park. And there is a plaque there, and every year there's a memorial event. The New York Fire Department brings a ladder that only reaches the 6th floor to show that's how far they could get up to those days. Now they have better technology to reach people in high-rise buildings, but they didn't at that time. So the women that were trapped in the top floors went to the roof and jumped, and most of them died from the fall. So yes, when Hamlet happened, I can remember, it was just a couple of years before I moved to North Carolina, but I remember hearing about it on the news. And even then, people were making the parallel. Gee, this sounds a lot like Triangle. People trapped in a factory fire, doors locked illegally. They couldn't get out. And I guess the one difference I will say is that Triangle actually led to more meaningful reforms. In New York State and even other states as well, after Triangle, there was actually a significant improvement in building code, fire safety, factory inspection laws. Now, again, not still what we would want today, but for its time, I would argue a more a more substantive change. And I'll also just mention one person that was deeply affected by it. After the fire, New York State set up an investigation commission. And one of the people who staffed it was a young social worker by the name of Frances Perkins, who in the 1930s became Franklin Roosevelt's Secretary of Labor, the first woman in a federal cabinet. And it's under Perkins that we get the National Labor Relations Act, the Wagner Act, which established the right to organize unions, even though the law is weak, and we could do a whole lecture on that, how companies today evade the law or drive loopholes through it. And also the Fair Labor Standards Act, which establishes the minimum wage, the 40-hour week, the ban on child labor, all of which, again, have exceptions and ways to kind of weasel around them, but the law is at least there. So Perkins says working on the investigation of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire is what made her passionate about worker rights and unions and worker protection.
Mm. Well, we're coming up on time here, most unfortunately, because I could literally just stay all night and keep talking to you guys, because as we've identified, it's so complex and so complicated and so tangled. But the closing question I would love to hear from each of you on, I find this to be a really emotionally grueling story to face. As I was joking with Howard earlier, I saw Orange Light and I literally just ugly cried through the entire thing, because it brings up a lot of hard questions about who we are as a country, who we are as a people, what we value, and again, like everything, it's so complicated. But one of the things I'm always telling our teachers to do when covering past and present events in their classroom that are particularly difficult is that they have to help their young folks find the resistance, find the hope, so that they can empower young people to basically fix what we older folks have broken so badly. So, in closing, I'd like to hear from each of you, where is the resistance in this story? Where is the hope? What is most important for us to know and teach, and how do we use it to move us forward? What are your thoughts?
Well, speaking specifically to the Hamlet situation, what you find is that Hamlet is a town of survivors.
Mm.
Hamlet's still very small. There's not a lot of industry there, but there's a lot of pride there. A lot of these, several of the survivors became involved in workers' rights in the labor movement as a result of what happened to them, to try to prevent the same thing from happening to others.
Mm.
And I think that one of the, and this is just a personal opinion, I think one of the reasons we are going through some of the things we're going through in this country is because of a lack of not simply understanding, but a lack of knowledge, and we need to get back to where facts are facts, and we don't have things like alternative facts. I mean, what is that? And I think, a lot of not knowing is because people choose not to know, but I think there's also an effort to keep people from knowing. Mm-hmm. When I was in school, we had civics. I don't think we even teach civics anymore. Most people don't even understand how our government works. And so I think one of the things that we have to do is we have to get back to facts, and we have to get back to people knowing. So teaching, the history, makes us better capable of not repeating it, but for many, many people have never heard of this story, in North Carolina, right? If you go to Hamlet and you go to the little museum there, which was really sad, they have information about everything about the history of the town and not one word about the fire.
Wow.
And the museum is around the corner from where the plant was, right? And so keeping the history in the memory, I think, is pivotal in breaking a cycle, and I think, that's where definitely one area where I think a lot of where we're hurting a little bit. You know, we don't know a lot, and we seek not to know a lot, and we like our, you know, little bubbles where everybody believes what we believe, whether it's true or false, and we just ignore, you know, science. We ignore facts, and that's become a real problem, and I think it's put us in a very precarious situation as a nation.
Absolutely. Joanna, what do you think?
So, there are so many possible answers here. There are actually a lot of places where I see hope. A lot of it for me is about the resilience of workers, both who went through this tragedy and used it as a springboard for activism, also workers who are still in this situation and who are finding modes of kind of everyday resistance. But I think for me, probably the biggest thing that gives me optimism here is the simple fact that this system doesn't have to stay the way it is. It's in the industry's benefit to get us to believe that this is just an ossified system, but it's not. And so I think that especially the more we force ourselves to look at it, and not just to look at specific instances of tragedy like the Hamlet fire, but at the paradigms that led to them, the racism, the consumerism, this addiction to cheap, and stop seeing those paradigms as just being the natural American way. Then I think these, you know, learning stories like this can be moments for reflection and for grief, but also opportunities for change. And especially with COVID-19, I think a lot of things that once felt unchangeable now feel a little malleable, now feel a little up in the air. So I would encourage folks who are feeling, like I often do, really disheartened about this theme, to seize on that possibility for change.
Yeah, thank you. What do you think, David?
I pick up on a couple things my colleagues have said, and one is the importance of paying attention to both history and memory, and the two are not the same, but they're linked to each other. And what you said, Howard, I've not seen the museum in Hamlet, but again, as a museum person, doesn't surprise me. All across North Carolina, there are various local museums that almost never say anything about work or labor or, God forbid, a union. I spent 5 years on the State Highway Historical Marker Commission, which is really kind of fun and cool. And we actually, one of the things we did, and we're doing more of, and I think the commission is still doing more of, is trying to get up markers that are, to be blunt, more diverse, not just dead white generals, but, you know, what women did, what Black people did, et cetera, what working people did. And it's really interesting. There are a few more markers about labor history, but if you talk to the folks in the Department of Cultural and Natural Resources, sometimes we get a marker ready and the local folks are like, we don't want that marker. You're talking about some strike 50 years ago. We don't want to talk about it. Why bring that up now? You know, someone got shot. Well, that, you know, bad for business. It's like, so labor history remains a kind of dirty word in some places. And the second thing I'll say is I'll come at this a little differently, and I don't want to be a pessimist, but it's a little bit about the power of pessimism in tragedy. In other words, I see this story as mainly it's just almost unrelentingly sad and brutal, and not a lot of good came out of it. You know, there were these few little weak attempts at reform. As Howard mentioned, there was a monetary settlement that was pathetically small when it got distributed to most people. But I would argue, and I know this is a challenge, particularly for K through 12 teachers, because often, particularly when you're dealing with younger children, you cannot lay too much tragedy on them. You have to be age appropriate. But the more you can say to people, whether it's a middle school student or a 50-year-old person, sometimes a story is sad and or makes you angry, but take your sadness and your anger and resolve that this should not happen again. You know, I'm going to be a real radical here. I'm going to quote Joe Hill, the IWW Wobbly organizer, who said, "Don't mourn, organize." So if you tell a story that actually doesn't have a happy ending, that in fact has mostly a sad ending, as Hamlet does, then I agree with what my colleagues have said. There is still stories of hope and resilience, and we should never say nothing, these people all just got beaten down, because they didn't. Some of them rose back up. But more of us can rise up, more of us can learn from tragedy to say, this should not happen again. And I completely agree with what you said, Joanna. Nothing is inevitable about this. This system doesn't have to be. And the fact that it is ossified and 130 years old doesn't mean it can't change. It just means people are stuck in their ways, and certain very rich people don't want it to change. Well, so what? They're still the minority. They're the 1%, not the 99%. The 99% can get up and say, this is wrong. And there are ways for consumers to change it. There are ways for voters to change it. There are ways for politicians and regulators to change it, even if the business folk at the top don't really want to change. But if there's enough pressure on them, they will change. They may not be happy about it, but they will change. So tell the story, tell the sadness, tell the tragedy, and then let that sort of tragedy, if there's anger, let it be righteous anger. Anger that doesn't, make you destructive, but make you say, I don't want this to happen again. This is not, again, I think about even when my children were young, how that sense of fairness, this is not fair. This makes me mad. Good. That's actually a good emotion to take away from this. Build on it.
Do something about it. Yeah. And the last thing that I would want to elevate here too is just the women, the incredible strength, perseverance, resilience of these women who got up every day to do this grueling, terrible work where, as you've said, it smells terrible. It's, your hands are frozen up from dealing with cold chicken all day. You're standing on cold concrete floors. It smells, your back is wrecked, because you're in the same position all day. But these women got up and did it because they had mouths to feed, right? And so they shouldn't have to, but the fact that they did, I think, just shows the power of a woman. And actually, on that note, I would love to have the incredible song from Orange Light that Howard Kraft wrote and the incredible Reese Palmer performed. I'm going to let that play us out. It's called Woman Through It All. And it's an anthem for, I feel like, working women. Howard, do you want to say a word about that song before we say goodbye and let it close out our event here this evening?
Well, I would just say that, the title of the song is the message that I got from the story. That, despite the conditions, despite, the treatment, at the end of the day, these women had families, and they had to put that aside, and they had to go out and they had to get that $5.25 because, Junior needed school shoes, or, Mary needed medicine, and that superseded, their own safety, their own health, their own well-being. And, and to me, that's just a testament to, as you were saying, just the determination of these women just to live a life. And so I wanted to write a song that could, kind of shine a little light on that. I think music and song is just another way that we can affect emotion in the human being to feel it in a different kind of way.
Right.
And when I was able to get Reese Palmer, an incredible country singer, to come on board and to do the song, was actually sung by Cree in the performance, senior at UNC. She did an incredible job. But yeah, that was I just really wanted to highlight, the struggle of the women in the plant and how they, would face it every day in their lives every day, and find meaning in it.
Yeah, right. Well, thank you, Howard Kraft. Thank you, David Zonderman. Thank you, Joanna Smith. Thank you so much. I appreciate each of you so much for spending this time. I know all of you, as soon as you heard it was for teachers, you signed right on, because I know each of you appreciate teachers so much. And I really do appreciate you for joining us. Thank you to the North Caroliniana Society for funding this event. Just so all of the teachers watching know, we are going to follow up with a whole list of resources, including all the books and things you've heard tonight, some articles, some primary sources. We are finishing a lesson plan for 8th through high school to teach about this event that will be shared with you in a few weeks. And we appreciate your time. Go vote. Early voting has started in North Carolina. Thank you for joining us. And as I said, we're going to play out with Woman Through It All, the lyrics by Howard Kraft and sang by the amazing Reese Palmer. So thank you guys. Have a good night.
Through it all.